This is a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Hello, you're listening to Beyond the Ballot Box with me, Dashran Yohan. Last weekend, the inaugural Unity Government National Convention was held at World Trade Center, Kuala Lumpur. A running theme from the National Convention was that of unity and cooperation between former rivals. A lot was said about history and how never in a million years would any Pakatan Harapan politician have thought that they would be giving speeches in the UMNO fortress. But was there anything substantive in terms of the vision for the country? Joining me on the show to discuss all things this convention is Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. Welcome to the show, James.
Good afternoon.
Perhaps you can kick off this conversation by sharing your overall thoughts on the Unity Government's first national convention.
Right. So my overall thought was that it went off as expected. There was no big kerfuffle among the different parties. Everybody played their role. So in terms of being a PR exercise, I thought it was quite successful. At least it sort of pushed all the different parties together and they all appear at least on stage to be on the same page. I think for most people, for most Malaysians who are not involved in the political process, I think they see this very much as a get-together among all the parties in government, and this is really the start of the electoral campaign for the crucial upcoming state elections in the 6 states in Peninsular Malaysia. So I think most people will see it basically through the lens that this is a get-together as all the parties prepare and work together for their first test, their first electoral test after forming the government last November.
Now, you mentioned PR, and I find that very a good word that you used there, because a running theme from this convention was that of bitter rivals turn comrades. There were plenty of slogans and cheesy poems being exchanged between former enemies, including Wee Ka Siong and Anthony Loke. Do you think they've successfully sold this unity government narrative to the public?
So I think in terms of selling the narrative, I think you need to look at two very distinct audience. One is of course people involved in the political process, and this involves party members, supporters from both sides of the aisles. So if you speak to Pakatan Harapan UMNO, of course they'll say that this was a very successful narrative. And if you speak to Perikatan, they'll just say it's terrible. These people can't sleep together. They don't share the same dream. And then you've got the large part of the general public. So as I mentioned earlier, I think for the general public, they see this very much as a PR exercise. And for most people, I think they're very cynical about Malaysian politics. I don't think there's any more surprises. I think for a very long time, the Malaysian public understands that, in Malaysian politics, you can't walk a straight line. And ever since, Mahathir switched to the opposition and brought down UMNO in 2018, people understand that the normal rules don't apply anymore. People can twist and turn. Today you're supporting this side, tomorrow you're supporting the other side. On the third day, you may be supporting another coalition. So I don't think, the media write out about this thing between, the pantun between Anthony Loke and Wee Ka Siong. Of course, it makes good news stories, but I think people are very cynical about the process. And I think people understand that, this is all about showing unity. Whether there's real unity or not, I think most people will take a wait and see attitude. So in terms, of trying to promote this unity narrative, I think for the individual parties involved in the process, I think it was partly successful. But I think among the general public, a lot of people that I've spoken to still believe that the gap between, say, UMNO and a party like the DAP, most people think that the gap is still quite wide, especially at the grassroots level.
You talk about the cynicism among the general public, but in real terms, from your analysis, how stable is the unity government right now? Because there are attempts to topple the current government seemingly by Perikatan Nasional. The Prime Minister himself has admitted this. When you watch, the convention, Do you get a sense that this, hodgepodge of partners that have come together to form this coalition, do you get the sense that of renewed purpose, cohesive plan, cohesive agenda, so on and so forth? Or is it just a sort of PR stunt? Because we have seen, even when UMNO and PAS previously, when they first announced Muafakat Nasional, there were similar conferences like this, right?
Yes, there was not only between Muafakat Nasional, don't forget they also held a bigger one, the Malay Dignity Congress. So
Right.
all this has been going on for a very long time. I think the way to understand this is that you need, some background to this issue about overthrowing the unity government. I think a lot of the talk about overthrowing the unity government comes down to a very simple, unwritten convention in Malaysian politics. So the unwritten convention in Malaysian politics that no federal government can be politically stable if you don't carry the Malay vote. So if you look at last November's general election, it is quite clear the people carrying the Malay vote is essentially Pakatan Harapan. The big winners is called PAS, and followed by Bersatu, and then followed by UMNO. So it is quite clear that they have the majority of the Malay vote now. And most people, at least in Peninsular Malaysia, understands that if you don't have the support of the majority race, i.e. the Malay voters, the government can't be stable. So that's the reason why all this talk about the government falling apart. Now, the other background to this issue is, of course, the anti-hopping law that was passed to make it almost impossible for individuals to jump across to the aisles because they will lose their seat. Previously, if you want to bring people towards your own party, you have to go and grab them individually. Now you don't have to. Now you just have to make sure that the party executive, especially the party president, supports you. And because the entire party moves as a bloc, you only have to win over the party president and the executive to bring over the entire bloc. A very simple example of this is what happened in November last year. I'm sure your listeners remember that initially Perikatan was gung-ho because they said that we had the support of GPS and we had the support of UMNO. But lo and behold, at the last minute, within 24 hours, UMNO said, no, we are moving towards Anwar Ibrahim, even though there was substantial opposition to Zahid's position. But they couldn't do anything because Zahid was the party president and he had to control the executive. So UMNO collectively as a bloc, and together with Barisan Nasional, they were all forced to move to Anwar's side. Same thing with GPS. When they move collectively over, they move over 23 seats altogether. So in some ways, politics, I'm not saying it's becoming more unstable. I'm just saying it's easier to bring people over now. Because rather than going out to grab individual MPs, if you can capture the party president or the party executive, this means that the entire bloc can move over. So in the case of Pakatan Harapan, it is quite clear they're looking at the coalitions in Sabah and Sarawak and trying to bring them over. So that's the reason why, if you read the Malay bloc, right, most of them are saying that the way to pull down this government is to bring the East Malaysians over initially and then get rid of Zahid internally in the party. We have a new leader, UMNO, and UMNO will bring the entire 30 MPs over. So, within these two backgrounds, they can understand why there's so much chatter about unity government falling down. Now, my own take is that all this talk about plotting to bring the unity government down, nothing will happen until the upcoming 6 state elections.
Right.
Because the incredible thing about these 6 state elections is that we have a real mosaic of Malaysia. So 3 of the 6 states are what we call the pure Malay heartland states, Kedah, Terengganu, Kelantan. And the other is more mixed, Selangor, Penang, and Negeri Sembilan. And we know that the economic powerhouse of Malaysia is Selangor and Penang. So, if you speak to those people controlling the betting rings, at the present moment, the betting is that you have 3-3. In other words, the status quo. The government will keep Negeri Sembilan, Selangor, and Penang, and the other side will keep the other 3. Now, the problem is this. Anwar Ibrahim and the unity government must be able to claw back at least significant number of seats in Kelantan and Terengganu to show that they have Malay support. Because if you look at the results of the November election, right, PAS and Bersatu basically sapu all the seats in Kelantan and Terengganu. So that's the reason why they can go around saying that they hold the Malay vote. Now, if UMNO cannot bring back a portion of the Malay vote, right, then we're back to square one, i.e. what I said earlier, that the current government do not have the support of the Malay community and therefore is politically unstable.
Now, Anwar talked about how if it wasn't for UMNO President Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, Malaysia would be in a very different trajectory right now post GE15. But will this coalition, this current coalition, Madani government, unity government, whatever you want to call it, truly be able to carry out its anti-corruption agenda and garner public acceptance if Zahid is part of the puzzle? More than that, will the government be able to sell itself with its clean image if Zahid is part of the mix?
The short answer is no. I think like everything in Malaysia, there's some nuances to this issue. Mm-hmm. So when they talk about cleaning up Malaysia, I think for most people, right, Malaysian corruption consists of two very distinct parts. One is the sort of petty corruption, which everybody knows that somebody who has done it. This is paying the policeman at the traffic stop. This is paying some government servants to get the paperwork done, small little things. Then there's the so-called grand corruption, which is at a very high level of government. Best example is that is the 1MDB affair. So I think when they talk about clean up the government, I think most people believe that yes, Anwar is serious about the small C, the small corruption, the petty corruption. But in terms of the big C, the big stuff, I don't think it's possible to do it, simply because those people involved in the big C are also the people controlling the levels of political power in Malaysia. And I think this situation has been around for a very long time. Everybody understands it. But the biggest problem, again, is something that you said. Zahid is in the picture. He's got outstanding corruption charges. Not only that, his best friend sitting in Kajang is also involved in 1MDB. So I think as long as these figures play a very prominent role in UMNO and prominent role in Anwar government, most people have the attitude that the big C will carry on, but Anwar will clean up the small petty corruption that we see left and right.
Zahid talked about the possibility of this government lasting longer than even GE16. That means they're not just talking about this current batch of state elections coming up, but the next general elections. Do you get the sense that this quote-unquote unity coalition will be a unit moving forward and perhaps even contest under the same logo down the line?
So the way to understand this is that Zahid knows very well that if UMNO moves to the other side, UMNO will be completely sidelined by Bersatu. The reason for that is very simple. Bersatu was set up specifically to replace UMNO as the UMNO party in the middle of the mainstream Malay voters. So he knows there's no space for UMNO. So even if UMNO jumps to the other side, they form a government perikatan, right? There will be a minor player. And also Zahid is not acceptable to the other side for a host of reasons. So Zahid has no choice. So my take is that as long as Zahid is in control of UMNO, yes, they will stay with Pakatan Harapan because he has no space on the other side. Now, whether they will move together and become closer for GE16 will depend very much on the performance of the government, whether they can deliver over the next 2 years. Now, in terms of the logo is a separate issue. Logo is mostly, you're talking about elections. So I think we saw that even during last November's election, PAS was using its own logo in certain states. And if you read the newspaper the last few days, it looks like UMNO will be using the Barisan Nasional logo for Kedah. Then they won't be using the so-called Pakatan logo or the Unity logo, whatever. In any case, it's my understanding that there is no such thing as Unity logo because we're talking about political coalition. Unity coalition is not a registered coalition according to the electoral rules in Malaysia. So I don't think we should worry more. We should worry about the issue. What we should really worry is that whether this government can bring Malaysia back. People keep forgetting that up to around 2012 and 2013, right? Malaysia was actually doing quite well. We had a fairly good economic growth. The economy was on track. There were some real reforms taking place. But then everything fell apart after 2013. So basically, from 2013 up to the present day, Malaysia has been going backwards. The joke among development economies that Malaysia has been taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So, and the country was really, really damaged during the COVID crisis. My take is that the economy was really, really damaged. So that's the reason why, for the very first time, you hear stories about people living in middle-class neighborhoods running out of food, people to dip into the EPF, just to buy food and keep the roof over their heads. I think it's much more important that we get the economy back on track, because if anything happens to the Malaysian economy, I think that will have major repercussions for ethnic relations in Malaysia. And that is a much more dangerous thing rather than these sort of games that people are playing.
Absolutely. I think you bring up an excellent point. Can this government bring this country back on track? And that's what we're going to be discussing after the break. On the show with me today is James Chin. He's a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. Keep it here on Beyond the Ballot Box, BFM 89.9. Welcome back to Beyond the Ballot Box. I'm Dashran Yohan, and on the show with me today is James Chin. He's a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and we're discussing the first Unity Government National Convention that took place last weekend. So, James, the government talked about 5 tenets, so to speak, which they will be focusing on. The first one is improving transparency and governance and plugging leakages. Now, this, I think, more than anything else, is something that Anwar has repeatedly stressed, good governance, so on and so forth. How do you think the government is performing so far in this regard?
I think it's a bit unfair for me to make a comment on the government's performance. I think we have to be realistic. The government has only been in power for a couple of months. They just came to power in November. And I think there was quite a long learning period. Talking to people in Kuala Lumpur, it seems that a lot of the people moving the government had no experience in government. Even the people that UMNO moves in, they were dealing with stuff that they never dealt with. A very simple analogy was that in most governments previously, UMNO was the driver. This time they were no longer driver, so it took a bit of time for them to settle down. And also in terms of policy, I think they're still getting to know each other. I think there hasn't been any major policies done. I think they've done a lot of firefighting. My own personal take was that I was pleasantly surprised, and I must give credit to Anwar Ibrahim for this. He did not pass a real election budget when he passed down the budget. That was quite a sensible budget. He didn't waste money on shiny objects. It was all about putting Malaysia back on track. I think moving forward, you will see some major government initiatives coming up after the state elections, because as I mentioned earlier, the state election is crucial for political stability. Assuming that the unity government will do quite well, they claw back some Malay seats and they show that they do have Malay support, then the government will be stabilized. Now, the problem with Malaysia is that, unfortunately, as I mentioned, for the last 10 years, nothing has been done basically with the economy in terms of real reforms. But this means that this government has to make some very hard decisions. Now, to really reform the Malaysian economy, right, you really need strong political capital. We all know what are the major problems in the Malaysian economy. One is that we're very inefficient. Productivity is basically dead in Malaysia. But more importantly, we need to reform the NEP type policy. Secondly, we need to increase wages across the board, and that is tied to productivity. We can't be a cheap country anymore. The reason is because cheap labor doesn't work anymore, because countries like Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia can just kill us off. There's no way we can, beat them on this cheap labor thing. We have to move up. And this thing requires a lot of capital, and it requires a real commitment on the government. You can see, right, our capital class, our business class, they do not want any reforms at all. In fact, they don't care whether Malaysia moves up to the next level. And I can say that openly, because you look at what happened when we raised the minimum wage to 1,500, right? All the major manufacturers group, businessman group, Chamber of Commerce, they were painting a doomsday picture scenario. They say thousands of people will lose their job, blah, 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 everything will fall apart. In fact, when they implemented it, nothing happened.
Right.
I don't recalling a lot of people suddenly losing their jobs, going on bread lines, begging on the streets, all those sort of thing. So basically, the bottom line is this: the government has really, really hard decisions to make to move Malaysia up to the next level. They have to plug the corruption, and most importantly, the biggest and hardest thing they have to reform. And unfortunately, I can't say that they can do, and that is to reform our education system, because our education system is not delivering what the country needs for the next generation.
So you brought up a lot of important points there. So at the let's touch on the economic aspect first, because at the convention, the government talked about the need to boost economic growth as a catalyst for development. This is, of course, important, right? We need to boost economic growth. But the question is, was there anything concrete mentioned about the economic vision of the government? Do we get a sense of what the long-term economic vision this government is trying to achieve?
The short answer is no. Like I said, they're all concentrating on these upcoming 6 state elections. So nobody wants to paint any long-term scenarios for Malaysia, but all this will come around. I think you have some very, good people in government, people who understands the real reforms to be needed in Malaysia. There are people who can put in plans. I don't think we should worry too much about the grand vision. I mean, if you talk about grand vision, the guy with the biggest grand vision is, of course, Mahathir for Wawasan 2020. Nothing happened. I think the problem with Malaysia is that the vision is one thing, but we always have problems with implementation. So unless we resolve the issue of implementation, I think whatever vision we come up with will be difficult. But as I said, the key reforms needed is to bring Malaysia up to the next level. And the key implementers in our Malaysian system is the civil service. So if you don't reform the civil service, unfortunately, we'll be back to square one.
I think you bring up a great point about, sometimes these grand visions, it's just PR and then ultimately perhaps it amounts to nothing. But I asked the question because it seems like, every few months there are some policy suggestions or proposals. Some might be good, some questionable. But there's very little clarity on what the end goal is and the steps needed to take, the steps needed that one needs to take to get there. For example, Anwar always talks about going up against billionaires, tuns, Tan Sris. Now, from my vantage point, that's great, right? But so far, there hasn't been any radical ideas about restructuring the economy or our tax system, for example, to take the money from these billionaires, tuns and Tan Sris, to make it, to distribute it more equitably and so on and so forth. What do you make of that? That there is their rhetoric, but we don't see that, very clear policy plans to sort of match the rhetoric.
Well, the bad news for you and your listeners is that going after the rich, the billionaires, all the big capital class in Malaysia, that is all talk. It is not possible. The reason is the nature of our political system. These people, they are not involved in the political process, but they fund the political process. So therefore, it is not possible to go after these people. Secondly, you can't go after these people if you're planning big changes in the economy, because these are the people who can deliver the big changes. So it's sort of a give and take. But normally with this capital class, you don't go after them, you negotiate with them. Yes, there are actually a lot of, good plans, especially about tax system. There's been discussion, but these discussions are not done in public. I think everything will come around in the next budget. I think they understand and they're hoping that they'll do very well in this upcoming 6-state election. They will have a period of political stability, and the budget towards this end of the year, I think you will see several surprises. My bottom line is that everything is riding on these 6-state elections. I think to try to second guess what they have, what they're planning to, I think there's no point in second guessing, because their ability to turn any of their ideas into practical reality, right? depends on the political capital, and the political capital depends on this upcoming six-state election. So that's the reason why I've been saying that, this six-state election is going to decide the future of the Anwar government.
Since you've mentioned the six states elections many times, right? So that is crucial at least from your vantage point, to what happens next, the following chapters in this Madani unity government. What are the variables we're looking at? If it's status quo, like you mentioned earlier, 3 states for Pakatan, 3 states for this unity government, will the government then be able to move forward at a faster pace? What if, the government does well in a state like Kuala or Terengganu? Or what if they perform terrible in a state like Penang and Selangor? Maybe even if they don't lose the state, but lose a lot more seats there compared to before. What would these 3 different variables mean for the government?
Okay, let's start the first one. If it is status quo, then the government has very limited space to move. It means they can't do any major policies because they'll be immediately planning for the general elections. If they do really well, in other words, they win the 3 states, or maybe even they win Kedah, in Kelantan and Terengganu, they claw back some Malay seats, and they can show that we have some significant Malay support, at least up to the 50% level. Then the government will come up with really big ideas and big policies because they have the political capital to do it. If the government does badly, say that, the opposition made significant gains in Penang and Selangor, then I would argue that Anwar Ibrahim government will be unstable at least until the next general election. There is a small possibility that parties may defect if the government does badly. But my reading of the situation is that if the government does badly in the upcoming 6-state election, the current unity government will hold for at least until the next budget cycle. People are not going to move immediately. They will still wait and see. But I think a lot of people in the background, what is at the back of their mind is that they're thinking that, if the government doesn't have the full support of the Malay community, right, and the Malay community will keep agitating through things like Mahathir's Malay Proclamation, which is basically Malay Dignity Congress 2.0 and all the other stuff, then the government will spend all the time firefighting, so nothing much will be done. And that's the reason why I said that, you have a prolonged period of political instability until GE16. Now, a lot of people, including myself, were actually arguing that GE15, the one that was held last year, was supposed to return political stability. But now we know that the Malaysian electorate has funny ideas. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people got it wrong, including myself, on last year was because of this chunk of new voters in the young people, which everyone concentrated on. But there was another large group of people which were totally ignored by all the Malaysian watchers. And these were people who were not registered. Remember, prior to the last general election, right, there was a big chunk of people who were not registered. So even though they're eligible above 21 years old, for all sorts of reasons, they refused to be registered. But because of automatic registration, they suddenly found themselves on the electoral roll. So it was not only the young people who came out to vote, but it was also this unregistered bloc that came out to vote. And these people, we don't have any background of the way they vote. So these people play a major role in GE16.
There's been plenty of talk about parties uniting, but at the convention, the government also talked about how it's in its interest to maintain unity among the people. But my question is, how? Has the government done enough to provide an alternative vision for Malaysia? For example, one where the masses are united by class. Because for one, Malaysia is highly polarized across racial and religious lines. Even many Harapan supporters are incredibly racist. Two, I'd argue that it's been a while since Malaysians have truly been united. I mean, tolerant, sure. I mean, that's our thing, right? Tolerancy. But united? How do you see the government carrying this agenda forward?
In terms of the big picture, the really, really big picture, I'll argue that there's basically 3 separate visions for what Malaysia is supposed to be. One is, of course, what we might call the conservative version of Malaysia. And that conservative version of Malaysia says that Islam will play a more prominent role in public space. Malaysia is increasingly becoming more Islamic. The second vision is, of course, the vision that says Malaysia is becoming more modern and more circular. And the third vision is what the people of Sabah and Sarawak wants Malaysia to be. So we talk about three very distinct visions. The problem is the vision of Malaysia becoming more Islamic is highly polarizing because it doesn't matter how you play around the statistics. The reality is that about 1/3 of the Malaysian population are non-Muslims, and even among the 60 or 65% of the population who are Muslim, right, there is no agreed consensus of what is Islamization of Malaysia, what does an Islamic state of Malaysia looks like. So this is a highly, highly polarizing debate. Now, you mentioned the word class. I can guarantee you that is the thing that all the elites in Malaysia fear. Because if you have class politics in this country, right, they can kiss their wealth goodbye. So there is no way that we will have any form of class politics in this country. I think we will see more racial and religious line being drawn. The thing that worries me is that if you draw a line, based on racial stuff, then there were areas for you to maneuver and negotiate, like what you had in 57, 63, and up to the 70s. But if you draw the line along religious line, then there is no space for negotiation. That is where the real problem lies. In terms of unity, I think the reality is that you will never get unity per se in Malaysia. What you want is that people will have multiple identities. They can be Malaysian, they can be Malaysian Chinese, Malaysian Indian, or whatever. I think that is the best we can hope for. To expect everybody on the same page, as I mentioned, is impossible because there are basically three large visions for Malaysia, and each of these people stay in their own lane. They do not want to negotiate with the other side. So increasingly, it will be highly polarized. So basically, because of that, that's the reason why I think this unity government was the very best outcome from last November. If the other side had gotten in, I think we will be in trouble because the other side is only promoting one vision. At least with this unity government, all the three visions I mentioned are represented. They may not get along very well, but at least they're represented on the top table. If the other side had gotten in, I can guarantee you that table is only reserved for one lot of people. And I think that is dangerous for a country like Malaysia.
It seems like your projection for Malaysia's future, we will never be united around class. There will not be a class struggle politics in Malaysia. We will truly never be united as one people. Isn't that like a kind of cynical approach to the country's future?
No, not at all. What I said was that we are all Malaysians one, but we can also be Chinese Malaysian at the same time.
Right.
We can be Indian Malaysian. We can be Malay Malaysians. Right now, the debate is that you can't. You're either Malaysian or you're Malay. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
They forces you in a corner. I'm saying that we can have multiple identities. This is actually very common around the world. You go to any country, both developing and developed countries, people have multiple identities. I don't understand why in Malaysia, right? You can have only one identity. If you're Muslim, you're Muslim. You're Christian, you're Christian. You're Buddhist, you're Buddhist. It's as if that, you can't have multiple identities. And yet, day to day, we all have multiple identities. We go and work in the office where it's a multiracial environment. So obviously, people see you as a Chinese Malaysian, as a Malay Malaysian, or, as an Indian Malaysian, or Iban Malaysian, or whatever. So, the reality is that we all have multiple identities. I'm not cynical or pessimistic about Malaysia. As I said earlier, if we can make fundamental, real reforms to the economy, if Malaysia becomes a rich society, then we stand a very good chance of promoting a modern, progressive Malaysia. The reality of Malaysia is if you look back in our very, very short history, right, a lot of crises will come around, because if the economy goes bad, then ethnic relation goes down the drain. So that's the reason why, I believe strongly, and I think most people agree with me, right? We need to make Malaysia a rich country. Then we can talk about, a lot of the things that people like you and I are worried about. And we want to build a better vision for Malaysia.
James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That was Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. If you missed any part of our conversation, you can also check us out on podcasts. We're available on the BFM app, BFM.my, or pretty much wherever you get your podcast from. I'm Dashran Yohan, and this has been Beyond the Ballot Box, BFM 89.9.
You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app.